today in our discussions, we've been using the framework of the Four Noble Truths. The very first teaching the Buddha gave after achieving enlightenment. And this is the sort of the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. So, what we saw in the Four Noble Truths was that the first two Noble Truths, the truth of suffering or dukkha and the truth of the cause or origin of suffering or dukkha, was the Buddha's diagnosis for us, that we are stuck in the state of dukkha, and the underlying cause for this state of dukkha is our mental afflictions and actions. And the root mental affliction is this fundamental ignorance, misunderstanding nature of reality. This is leading to the attachment, aversion and other mental afflictions, driving our behaviour, resulting in all of our experiences, this state of dukkha. And of course the Buddhist assertion is that we're stuck in this state not just in this life, but life after life. And this cycling in this state is called samsara. Samsara, often translated into English as cyclic existence, the fact that we're cycling life after life in this condition of dukkha. Of course, the Buddha's prognosis was very good, was that we can overcome this state, this cycling. We can transcend samsara. We can achieve a healthy state, a state of liberation from all suffering and its causes. That healthy state, of course, is called nirvana. How do we achieve that goal? Was the fourth noble truth, truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the medicine. So what I'd like to do is to begin there and build on that framework using this three vehicles chart that you have. So let's bring that out. Vehicle is something, in general, a vehicle, of course, is something that can take us from A to B. So within the Four Noble Truths teachings, then the goal is personal liberation from this cycle of existence called samsara, the goal of nirvana. And as we saw earlier, the vehicles or the traditions of Buddhism that have as their goal nirvana are now collectively called Theravada vehicle. So on the basis of the Four Noble Truths teachings, these level of teachings then are spread in India and beyond through the Pali language and spread to Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and so forth. So in these Theravada traditions, they're coming from the original language of Pali. Based on the Four Noble Truths, the goal of the spiritual path is nirvana. And someone who's achieved this goal of nirvana, someone who's transcended samsara, is called an arhat. An arhat is a Sanskrit word, and often this is translated into English as something like foe destroyer, or someone who's destroyed the enemy. So what enemy has the arhat destroyed is the enemy of the mental afflictions, particularly ignorance. And as we saw yesterday, or I think this morning rather, the aspiration we need to develop here is this aspiration called renunciation. So remember again, this is not a very good translation. The original term here is nisarana. And nisarana again was this, literally means to to get out of, to go out of, to move beyond. So renunciation, or the original word, is the aspiration to move out of samsara, to be liberated from samsara, to strive for the goal of nirvana. So renunciation is an aspiration for liberation, an aspiration for nirvana. So this is the entry point into the Buddhist spiritual path. Yeah, in Tibetan the word is ne chung. Ne means certain or definite, chung means to emerge. So often then, literally from Tibetan, it's definite emergence. The mind that definitely wants to emerge from samsara towards nirvana. The practices, so remember this is the fourth noble truth here, truth of the path. Within the Four Noble Truths teachings, when this truth of the path leading to cessation, the medicine, is most commonly presented here as this noble eightfold path. And you see in your chart there a list of the 8 practices. Those 8 practices can be condensed into 3 main areas of practice, and we see that also in the chart, called the 3 higher trainings. And the 3 higher trainings, as we see in the chart, are ethics. Here ethics simply means abandoning harmful, non-virtuous behaviour. Concentration, developing single-pointed concentration. We mentioned yesterday evening a level of concentration we can develop here is called shamatha. So this is the concentration practice. And then the wisdom practice here is the wisdom realising the nature of reality. Now, within the Theravada system, based on the Four Noble Truths, the fundamental ignorance that we're suffering from is the fundamental ignorance of grasping onto an autonomous self. Believing that there is something here, there's a me that's more than the body and the mind, something more than that, that there's this autonomous me here, self-sufficient, existent me, this autonomous, what's called autonomous self. We grasp onto that. That's how we believe we exist. In the Theravada traditions, this is the fundamental ignorance that leads to mental afflictions and suffering. So in the wisdom practice, and another name for wisdom practice, of course, is vipassana, or here in Pali, it's vipassana. So the vipassana or wisdom practice here, we are to come to realize no autonomous self. But actually here in the vipassana practice, there are 3 insights we are trying to cultivate, as we see here in that chart in your last column, called the 3 marks of existence. So in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about doing vipassana practice, they're mainly talking about coming to gain these 3 insights. And of course the first is impermanence. To come to realize everything's changing moment by moment. And if we can realize impermanence, rather than now we have an intellectual understanding of it, but if we can bring that into experience, if we can come to realize this in meditation, to directly experience the fact that everything's changing moment by moment, that realization itself will cause a dramatic decrease in our attachment and aversion in general. Because attachment and aversion can only operate if they try to grab something or push against something. So if we realize directly that things are changing moment by moment, then attachment has nothing to grab, and aversion has nothing to push against, because everything's just constantly changing. So by realizing this, already our lives have dramatically improved. Our attachment and aversion dramatically decrease. And on the basis of realizing impermanence, that will be the basis for the second one, to come to realize here where it says suffering or dukkha. Because if we realize everything's changing moment by moment, then of course there's nothing out there that's going to give us genuine lasting happiness. And then it'll be more easy to come to realize dukkha, this unsatisfactory state we find ourselves in. If we realize we are stuck in this state, we're going to stop looking for happiness out there, and we're going to develop renunciation, the wish for liberation from suffering, understanding that the cause of suffering and happiness is within ourselves. So by realizing this, we'll be able to develop this aspiration. Once we've developed that aspiration, we need to strive for the goal of nirvana. So we need the third insight for that. And that is to come to realize no self, that there is no autonomous me here. Because this grasping onto autonomous self is considered within the Theravada to be the fundamental ignorance that is the root of all mental afflictions and suffering. So if we can realize no self, we can overcome ignorance and all the mental afflictions and all suffering. And so by realizing this, we can achieve the goal of nirvana. So this is the Four Noble Truths as it's then implemented in the Theravada traditions. Any questions about that?
Hi. I'm still going to go back on one thing I had asked you. I remembered when you had said, and I agree, that we're not our mind and our body, and we have a mind and body. But if I say I have a mind and body, I'm still looking at the what is the I if there's no self.
Right. So we're going to talk more about this on Saturday morning when we go into the Vipassana practice in more detail. But a short answer here, of course, is self is a overinflated false sense of me. So we're not saying here there's no me, no person. We're saying we do not exist in this way. Of course there's a me, there's a person. The question is, how do we exist? Not whether or not we exist. And here it's a realization that we are not an autonomous, self-existent me. There's no such me. That's what no self means. Then, of course, the question is then, how do I exist? And we're going to look at that on Saturday morning in the context of Vipassana practice.
I think that impermanence can only help us to understand the second type of dukkha. Is
Correct.
that enough for Arjun? Is that enough?
No. So, yes, so impermanence is going to help us particularly in terms of the dukkha of change, the pleasant. Yes.
But the main one is the third. So
Third. So we still, of course, we have to still reflect on that. And once we come to realize that third level of dukkha, the all-pervasive, then we can really develop this. Yes. Yes.
Are moksha and the samadhi same as nirvana?
Moksha is liberation. So when we talk about moksha, we're talking about nirvana.
Same?
Same.
And the
In
samadhi?
Buddhism. Of course, these words are used in other traditions as well. So what moksha means in other traditions, I don't know. I mean, probably some sort of liberation. But here, when we talk about moksha, we're talking about this goal of nirvana.
And samadhi?
Samadhi is concentration. So we are here concentration in general is samadhi, is a translation of the Sanskrit word samadhi. We can develop many levels of concentration or many levels of samadhi are possible. The minimum level of samadhi that we need to develop is called shamatha in Sanskrit. Above that we have 4 levels called the 4 dhyanas. So actually in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about the concentration or samadhi practice, normally you won't hear much about shamatha. They often talk about the 4 dhyanas. We need to cultivate the 4 dhyanas, which is just another level of samadhi. But it's still samadhi.
The Theravada doesn't use the definition of Buddhahood.
Right, okay. So, that's what we're going to see now in the Mahayana. We're going to talk about the goal of enlightenment. Now, the relationship between nirvana and enlightenment is that in the Theravada vehicle, because that's based on the Four Noble Truths teachings, then generally in the Theravada vehicle, it's considered that this goal of enlightenment, only really this one special person, Prince Siddhartha, had the ability to achieve that goal. For us mere mortals, that's too difficult. But we can achieve the goal of nirvana. So often then, in the Theravada vehicle, they don't really have this distinction of nirvana and enlightenment. They really just talk about the goal of nirvana. Whereas in the Mahayana, which we're going to look at now, there is a distinction, and we all can achieve enlightenment. We have that potential. So an implication in the Theravada view, or Theravada vehicle rather, is that when we achieve nirvana, and then this body finishes, with this life finishes, then often they have this sort of analogy. They say it's like a candle going out. End of story. So then someone who's achieved nirvana, or even the Buddha who achieved enlightenment, at the end of their life, finished. No more to be seen anywhere. So for them, the idea that an enlightened being can come back and appear again is impossible, according to their understanding. This is very different to the Mahayana understanding, of course. Anything else here? Yeah.
Maybe it's superficial understanding, but it helps me to understand. Maybe the no self is like no ego, no self-centered point of view.
What we will find is that this grasping onto self really causes self-cherishing, because without this sort of false sense of self, what's there? Self-cherishing doesn't make any sense. And then the word ego, you could relate that, but personally I don't like to use the word ego, because I think even in psychology there are different ideas about what that word means. So if I say self equals ego, then we may get here 6 different ideas about what ego means, and then mass confusion. So I prefer not to use that word, but if we have the idea that ego is an overinflated false sense of me, then we could equate that to self, but only there. So it depends really a little bit how you define the word ego. But sometimes you'll hear Buddhist teachers sort of talking about it in that way, as if ego is same as self, but you have to be careful on your understanding of the word ego. That's all. Okay. So this is based on the Four Noble Truths teachings. But then the Buddha also taught, particularly in what's called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, he taught that actually there is a further goal that we can achieve beyond nirvana, And that is the goal of enlightenment. And enlightenment, of course, in Sanskrit is bodhi. Someone who's achieved the goal of enlightenment is called Buddha. And the system of teachings, particularly these perfection of wisdom teachings that the Buddha taught, form the basis of now what's called the Mahayana traditions, the Mahayana vehicle. And these teachings were transmitted in the Sanskrit language. And of course the Mahayana traditions now include Zen, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese and Tibetan Buddhism. And so here in this vehicle, or these traditions, the final goal of the spiritual path is enlightenment. And like the Theravada, of course we need to first develop an aspiration for that goal, to strive for that goal. And that aspiration is called bodhicitta. Chitta is Sanskrit for mind, and bodhi is Sanskrit for enlightenment. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. It's the mind which aspires to enlightenment in order to help liberate everyone else from suffering.
What is enlightenment?
Bodhi. Bodhi is enlightenment and chitta is mind. So here, of course, we can understand that we're not the only ones stuck in samsara, everyone else is. So we can have not only the aspiration to liberate ourselves from samsara, but develop an aspiration to help liberate everyone else. But of course, if we look at ourselves now, we're not in a very good state to be able to be very helpful in benefiting others. So how can we be most effective in helping to liberate others is if we achieve full awakening. If we achieve enlightenment, then we can be most effective in helping to liberate others. So bodhicitta is that aspiration. It's that aspiration for enlightenment so that we can effectively help to liberate everyone else from suffering. Someone who's developed this aspiration of bodhicitta is called a bodhisattva. Again, bodhi is enlightenment. Sattva has many meanings. Here, sattva means courage or strength. So a bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment for the welfare of others. And when that bodhisattva achieves enlightenment, they become Buddha. How do we get to enlightenment? What are the practices? Generally, the practices here listed as the 6 perfections. We see that in your chart. And we see them listed there: generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom. Generosity is defined simply as the intention to give. And we can be generous in a number of different ways. Of course, the most simple way to be generous with material things, to give money and food and clothing and material things. We can also give protection, so we can help to protect people from danger or fear. And we can also give what's called dharma, meaning teachings. We can give advice and guidance to others, help others on the spiritual path. So these are different ways of practicing this giving or generosity. Ethics here in the 6 perfections, like in the Eightfold Path or 3 higher trainings, it's abandoning harmful, non-virtuous behaviour, but also it's more proactive ethics here in Mahayana. It's not only abandoning harmful behaviour, it's the ethics of engaging in virtuous behaviour and also the ethics of benefiting others, of helping others. All of that is included within ethics, so much more proactive. Patience, as we saw earlier, is defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation, so we're cultivating that attitude. Joyous effort here, very important. Normally when we see this word effort, we feel like, we have to grit our teeth and push through something. But here, joyous effort is defined simply as a mind that delights in virtue. In other words, a mind that is happy to do good things. So if we're happy to do good things, it actually becomes quite effortless. So joyous effort here is all about joyfully engaging in these practices. If we see these sort of practices as some sort of hardship, we've missed the point. So joyous effort is really about developing that delight in doing these things. And then the last two is concentration and wisdom. Those 6 perfections, we can, like the Eightfold Path, we can condense into the same 3 core areas of practice. Because generosity, ethics, and patience can be condensed into ethics. And then we have concentration and wisdom, and joyous effort is something we need to apply to all 3 areas. So also in the Mahayana, we have the same 3 core areas of practice: ethics, concentration, wisdom. Now here, in the Mahayana, the wisdom practice in the 6 perfections, or Vipassana practice, we can see in the column, the last column, when in the Mahayana, when we talk about the wisdom practice or Vipassana practice, we are mainly talking about gaining the insight into emptiness. In Sanskrit, shunyata. And this insight into emptiness, here emptiness means to come to realize that there is no independent me, no independent objective world. One second. So too much talking. So emptiness is a translation of the Sanskrit word shunyata. And emptiness is a realization of the nature of reality. I'll come back in a minute. And it's a realization that there's no independent me, no independent objective world. So emptiness is not a realization that nothing really exists. It's a realization that nothing exists independently. Everything's empty of existing independently. So that's what a realization of emptiness is a realization that nothing exists independently. Everything's empty of existing independently. So this is the realization that we need to cultivate if we want to achieve the goal of enlightenment. So in the Mahayana traditions, when they talk about Vipassana practice, they're mainly talking about realizing emptiness. And we're going to be looking at this practice in more detail on Saturday morning. So this is very briefly the Mahayana vehicle. Any questions about Mahayana?
So the bodhisattva, just by nature of deciding to aspire towards enlightenment for all, makes you a bodhisattva?
Right, but what we're talking about here is, if you look in your 3 vehicles, no, it actually doesn't say in the 3 vehicles chart. But a bodhisattva is someone who has what's called uncontrived bodhicitta. Meaning, now of course, we can sit down and think about, oh yeah, everyone's suffering. Yeah, it would be really nice if I achieved enlightenment to help others. And so that's contrived. So by thinking, we might for a short time develop a very weak aspiration. Yes, I'd like to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of others. And then a few minutes later, we're back to our selfish behaviour. We've forgotten it. That's not a bodhisattva. We need to keep cultivating that. We need to strengthen it to the point where this aspiration is with us the whole day, spontaneously, continuously there. Meaning everything we do in our daily life, we're doing with this motivation. Everything. Then we're a bodhisattva. Now we can try, but it's only when this motivation is something that is fully developed and that it's spontaneous and continuously there throughout the day. Then we're a bodhisattva. And that is the entry point into the Mahayana path.
Are right effort and joyous effort the same?
No. Right effort here, I think, is talking about simply increasing positive behaviour and decreasing negative behaviour. So when we see all those right, it means directed in a good way. So of course the effort there should be with joy, but when we look at right effort, it's mainly talking about reducing and eliminating negative behaviour actions and increasing the positive behaviour, effort in that sense. Joyous effort here, again, is just delighting in doing good things. So of course there's a lot of overlap, but I don't think they're exactly the same thing. Because also, when we talk about the 6 perfections, what makes generosity the perfection of generosity is when generosity is motivated by bodhicitta. That's what makes perfection of generosity. Because only then are these actions a cause for enlightenment, if we have that motivation behind it. So there's also that difference, is that in the Mahayana, all these 6 perfections are sustained by the aspiration of bodhicitta.
One more question. Isn't Theravada, was it prior to the Mahayana? Historically, I mean.
Okay, yeah. So the Buddha taught according to people's capacity. So to this people he taught this, to this people he taught this. So he taught many different things to many different people. And of course, these ideas here are a little bit easier to appreciate and implement. This is much more profound and difficult to implement. So these ideas he taught very widely, and so this is what really started to spread after the time of the Buddha, because this is the foundation. This was only taught to relatively few individuals who could appreciate, and so after the time of the Buddha there wasn't a lot of this being practiced, and it took some centuries for it to really gain momentum in India. So therefore, initially after the time of the Buddha, it was this level of practice that was most widely practiced, and that's what initially then spread to Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. It was some centuries later when this really started to more widely be practiced. That's when Buddhism went up through the northwest over the Himalayas. So that's why this then, at a later time, because it's more widely disseminated in India, spread that way.
I think you're implying some hierarchy between the two different...
Okay, so to answer that, I'd like to add a little bit more. Okay. So in the chart here we have Vajrayana as the third vehicle. And Vajrayana, or sometimes called Tantra, has, like Mahayana, the same goal of enlightenment. We are to develop the same aspiration, of course. And in the Vipassana practice, we develop the same wisdom of emptiness. What's different is that in the Vajrayana or Tantra level of practice, as I briefly mentioned earlier when we talked about levels of mind, we're trying, in Tantra, Vajrayana, we're trying to gain access to this subtle and very subtle level of mind. And to do that, we have these two stages practices called generation stage and completion stage. In these practices, we are slowly gaining access to this very subtle mind, sometimes called mind of clear light, sometimes it's called primordial mind. In the Nyingma tradition, it's called Rigpa. Sometimes in some traditions, they call it a pure awareness. Many different names. But in using these two practices, we can gain access to those very subtle mind, and use that to realize emptiness. Because it's a more subtle mind, more powerful, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment. So Vajrayana is a way of accelerating the path to enlightenment. So what we can see here is these are not somehow three different systems, but rather they are three levels of practice. So the foundation level is Theravada. If we want to practice the Mahayana, this is the basis. If we want to practice Vajrayana, both of these together is the basis. So these are like levels of practice. Now, does that mean if you want to follow a Mahayana tradition, first you have to go and find a Theravada tradition? No, because all of these practices here within Theravada form the initial practices in the Mahayana. But these are really levels of practice. So the question?
Right. It's partly answered, but I'm wondering really how it works. If there are countries that only practice the Theravada, are they really aware of this difference?
Yeah. So, of course, generally within the Theravada vehicles, the scriptures they received are the Pali tradition. And in those teachings, there was no mention of this. So often in the Theravada traditions, they will say, well, this is not the word of the Buddha because it's not in our texts. But what we need to be careful of is that there's a difference between the philosophy of a tradition versus what an actual practitioner is realizing. Big difference. So even though someone may be practicing Theravada and trying to realize this no self, in their practice they may actually come to realize emptiness, even though emptiness is not really directly taught here. So we need to be careful about that. And as we progress in the higher levels of the path, we will, regardless of where we began, we will naturally move to the deeper level practices anyway.
You explained earlier what is generation and
Okay.
interpretation, or I missed
Okay,
it?
no, I didn't, but I'll add that in a little bit now. One other difference between Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana is both in the Theravada and Mahayana traditions, these are called causal vehicles. Meaning, in these two vehicles, we have the perspective of the cause. There is the goal of nirvana enlightenment. These are the practices that I need to do to create the cause to get there to that result. So we're looking forward on the spiritual path from the perspective of the cause. Vajrayana is the complete opposite. It's often called resultant vehicle. Because in Vajrayana or Tantra practice, we do the practice from the perspective of the result, of the perspective of being in the enlightened state. And this perspective is sometimes also adopted in sport. You know, often we see people preparing for an event and they imagine having done their activity and having achieved the result, and then they do their activity, and it really helps them to achieve that goal. So here in the Vajrayana or Tantra, the practices are done with the perspective of imagining we're already enlightened. This is a very powerful approach.
Very modern.
Modern?
Yeah.
This is 2,000 years old.
Yeah, that's nice.
So that brings to two stages. So generation stage is about, often in the generation stage we have what's called a practice manual called a sadhana. And in that sadhana we do exactly this. We imagine being in the enlightened state and then doing all sorts of visualizations, often involves some mantra recitation and doing other things. And this is very powerful. And this is preparing us for completion stage. Because in completion stage practice, we're trying to gain access to this very subtle mind. To do that, we have to basically withdraw all the subtle energies in the subtle body into what's called the central channel and bring all the subtle energies in our body to what's called the heart chakra. And if we can dissolve all subtle energies here and cause the heart chakra to open, we can cause the very subtle mind to become manifest or active. So that's what we're doing in completion stage. We're doing a lot of subtle body work, trying to cause this very subtle mind to become manifest. And then we use that to realize emptiness. So this is the two stages in Vajrayana or Tantra.
Generation?
Generation stage involves many things. One of the things we do a lot early in generation stage is this practice, this sadhana practice, visualizing ourselves in the enlightened form, doing various visualizations, reciting mantras and doing other things to prepare ourselves for that completion stage. It's like a preparation for the completion stage practice.
And the completion is...
You're manipulating subtle energies, withdrawing all subtle energies.
Like the Qigong, for example? To open...
Well, a little bit deeper than that, maybe. Maybe, yes.
No, because you say that the chakra of heart...
Right. We need to be careful when we hear about subtle energies and chakras. There are many traditions and systems that talk about this, but what they mean about them is not the same.
Oh, so it's different from the Chinese?
I don't know how the Chinese work with it, but just because a system talks about subtle energies and chakras doesn't mean they have the same idea of what that is and how to work with it.
Okay.
You know?
You said that there are different languages. This is in Pali and this is in Sanskrit.
Yeah. So also Sanskrit.
Can you practice Tantra without practicing Dhyana or Theravada first?
That's what I was hoping someone would ask. The answer is no. These are levels of practice. Now, as far as I'm aware, the only system or tradition of Buddhism that has a complete form of Vajrayana practice is Tibetan Buddhism. Because Vajrayana only really became widely practiced in India from about the 8th century onwards, 8th till 12th. And by the 8th century, Buddhism had spread to pretty well all countries except Tibet. So when Buddhism spread to Tibet from the 8th to the 11th century, Vajrayana was widely practiced in India, so that came with everything else into Tibet. Whereas most of the other countries, Buddhism spread before this was widely practiced and available. And so this really only exists, in, as far as I'm aware, in Buddhism in a fully developed form within Tibetan Buddhism. To practice Vajrayana or Tantra, it's said we need three things as a basis. We need renunciation, we need bodhicitta, and we need the wisdom of emptiness. We need these three things to be an effective basis. Otherwise, practicing Tantra, particularly this when we start about the generation stage, imagining the fully enlightened form, to really do that properly, we need this. And we need the right motivation. Otherwise, doing this practice is just a game. Oh, I'm pretending to be Vajrayogini. I'm pretending to be Tara. If that's what we think, we've completely missed the point. Completely missed the point. So then this only really becomes a game, and a potentially ego-boosting game. So actually it can harm us a lot if we practice. Either we waste our time here, or it can harm us a lot. They're basically the two things that are going to happen if we don't have the basis. We'll be wasting our time a lot, and it could potentially just be boosting the ego and making what's called a spiritual ego, and that's one of the worst. Because it's a sense of superiority, you know, I'm a tantric practitioner, you know.
This is developed in Tibet?
No, in India. In India, but it only really started to become widely practiced in India from about the 8th to the 11th or 12th century. Of course, at the 12th century mark, there was an invasion into India and Buddhism got wiped out in India in the 12th century.
But you said something about the split in Buddhism?
Yeah, so before up to the 8th century, Buddhism had spread to most other countries already. But then Vajrayana wasn't part of the spread because it wasn't widely practiced in India. It only started to become widely practiced from the 8th century to the 11th. That's exactly the time that Buddhism spread to Tibet. So then Vajrayana came with everything else to Tibet.
What was the third thing you said you needed for Vajrayana?
Realization of emptiness.
I had the emptiness, the renunciation. What was the third?
Bodhicitta.
Bodhicitta.
Yeah, those three things. Yeah.
What is the connection between this and between the Tantra as a sexual thing?
Right. First is, of course, Tantra exists not just in Buddhism. There's Hindu Tantra and probably other types of Tantra. So just because we see the name, we shouldn't assume they're all the same. There's probably some similarity and overlap, but here I'm only talking about Buddhist Tantra. And in Buddhist Tantra, at the very, very high level of Buddhist Tantra, there are practices that involve those sort of energies. But to actually use those practices to transform those energies is like extremely difficult. And if you're doing these sort of practices with like a consort or something, and you think about sex, then you're not doing the practice. It's not anything to do with sex.